She had 4 children with her own grandfather. This is the dark and disturbing history of the Caldwell family, inhabitants of the depths of the Missouri mountains, where for generations, geographical and social isolation has paved the way to practices that defy not only the laws of society, but also those of human nature itself. In the early 1950s, when the rest of America thrived in the post-war period, there were communities that remained practically untouched by progress. Among the dense forests and hidden valleys from the Missouri mountains, the Caldwell family lived on a 40-acre property, away from the main and virtually invisible roads to the outside world. The first news about Caldwell arrived at authorities in 1957, when a lost hunter happened to chance the property and witnessed something that deeply disturbed him. Children with visible physical characteristics of genetic degeneration, working alongside adults with countenance who suggested too close kinship. The family patriarch, Harold Caldwell, born in 1897, ruled the small clan with iron hand. Widowers since 1943, when his wife Mabel passed away during the delivery of his 3rd daughter, Harold moved further from civilization, creating his own rules and establishing a kind of isolated microculture where his word was absolute law. What happens in the mountains is in the mountains. This was the unofficial motto of the isolated families of this region, and for Caldwell, it became the justification for behaviors that would be considered unthinkable anywhere else. Martha Caldwell, born in 1938, was Harold's granddaughter. Her mother, Eliza, had died when Martha was only 8 years old, leaving her in her grandfather's care. What the authorities would discover years later would overcome the limits of human understanding. From the 13 years of Martha, a forbidden relationship was established with his own grandfather, resulting in the birth of 4 children between 1952 and 1957. Preliminary investigations revealed a pattern of consanguineous unions that dating back to previous generations in the Caldwell family. Isolation was not only geographical, but ideological. Harold, whose parents themselves were first-degree cousins, had grown with the distorted notion that maintaining pure blood was a tradition to be preserved. Dr. William Reynolds, a rural doctor who first documented the case to the authorities in 1958, described the situation as the most extreme example of human degradation by prolonged consanguinity that had already witnessed in her 30 years of medical practice. Children showed clear signs of genetic problems, reduced stature, atypical facial characteristics, obvious cognitive difficulties, and in 2 cases, congenital heart malformations, Dr. Reynolds told his confidential report to the Missouri Department of Social Services. The most disturbing was the normalization of this reality within that microcosm. Martha, then 20 when the authorities intervened, showed clear signs of psychological conditioning and did not fully understand that her situation was not normal. For her, that was the only reality she knew. Caldwell's property, with their main wooden timing and small attached buildings, formed a family complex where approximately 17 people lived, all related to 2 close blood ties. Isolation was so deep that some of the youngest children could barely articulate words, developing their own form of communication, almost incomprehensible to strangers. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. The stories we reveal are fundamental historical documents that remain deliberately hidden from official books. Only our subscribers have access to these forbidden truths that shape our society to this day. The history of consanguinity in the Caldwell family did not start with Harold and his granddaughter Martha. Historical documents recovered by social researchers revealed a standard that dated in the late 19th century, when the first Caldwell settled in the Ork Mountains. Josiah Caldwell, Harold's grandfather, had arrived in the region in 1878, fleeing accusations in North Carolina. The records indicated that Josiah had already been investigated by inadequate family practices in his homeland, although the euphemistic language of the time made it difficult to determine the exact nature of the accusations. In the mountains of Missouri, Josiah found the perfect isolation to establish his own kingdom. He married his second-degree cousin, Abigail, and together they had 8 children, 3 of whom did not survive beyond the first years of life due to congenital complications not diagnosed at the time. This first generation of Caldwell in Missouri has established a pattern of deep distrust regarding the world from the outside. They educated their children without contact with formal schools, developed their own folk medicine system, and rejected any external interference, even when offered as aid. These isolated families develop a kind of ideological protector shield, explained Dr. Eleanor Simmons, an anthropologist who studied isolated communities in the Appalachians and Ozarks during the 1960s. For them, the outside world represents a threat to their existence, and any external practice is seen as corrupt or dangerous. The next generation of Caldwell deepened this isolation. Ernest Caldwell, son of Josiah and Harold's father, married his own first cousin Susan. This union, held without any official record in 1895, produced 5 children, including Harold. Fragmentary medical records, recovered from a traveling doctor who visited the region in 1910, indicated that all the sons of Ernest and Susan had distinctive characteristics of consanguinity, including short stature, severe dental problems, and tendency to chronic respiratory diseases. Harold, born in 1897, grew in this environment where endogamy was normalized and even encouraged. In 1920, he married Mabel Jenkins, a young woman from an equally isolated neighboring family. What was not documented at the time, but was discovered during the 1958 investigations, was that Mabel was actually his second-degree cousin on the maternal side. The union of Harold and Mabel produced 3 children: Daniel, 1923, Eliza, 1927, and Ruth, 1943. Mabel passed away during Ruth's delivery, leaving Harold to raise his 3 children alone, which further intensified his isolation and distrust of the outside world. Eliza, Martha's mother, was briefly married with James Turner, an outside man who worked on the construction of roads in the region. This was one of the few moments when new blood entered the Caldwell lineage. However, James abandoned Eliza when she discovered her pregnancy, and she returned to family property with her newborn daughter, Martha. When Eliza died in 1946, a victim of untreated pneumonia, Martha was entirely under the care of her grandfather Harold. The testimonials collected in 1958 suggest that it was during this time that Harold began to psychologically prepare his granddaughter for the role he intended to assume. It's a classic case of conditioning and isolation, explained Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, a forensic psychiatrist consulted during the investigations. With no external references of normality, the child gradually accepts the distorted reality presented to him as unique and natural. Martha, growing without contact with other children outside the family circle, without formal education and without exposure to conventional social values, became the perfect victim for Harold's psychological control. At 13, in 1951, the Forbidden's relationship was established, resulting in the birth of his first child, Adam, the following year. Between 1952 and 1957, Martha gave birth to 4 children: Adam, Sarah, Joseph, and Rebecca. All had clear signs of genetic problems resulting from extreme consanguinity. Adam was born with a cardiac malformation that required medical care, but Harold refused to seek help, resulting in the boy's death at the age of 3. The records indicate that the official cause of death was recorded as fever, but later investigations suggested that these were complications not treated of their congenital heart condition. Caldwell's fate of the family moved irrevocably in November 1957, when Hunter Frank Weber got lost during a storm in the Ork Mountains. Seeking shelter, he accidentally found Caldwell's property and witnessed scenes that deeply disturbed him. "I saw children who didn't seem normal," Weber told authorities in Jefferson City. "There was something wrong with their faces, the way they moved, and the way that old man looked at the young girl. It wasn't a grandfather's gaze to a granddaughter." Weber, disturbed by what he saw, was not well received by the family. Harold Caldwell expelled him from the property under the sight of a shotgun. Upon returning to civilization, Weber reported his observations to local sheriff John Pritchard, who initially proved skeptical. "We have many isolated families in these mountains, Frank," said the sheriff. "They are different, yes, but we cannot interfere just because they live in their own way." However, when Weber mentioned the apparent conditions of the children and the young age of his mother, the sheriff was obliged to investigate. In January 1958, accompanied by Dr. William Reynolds and 2 deputies, Pritchard visited Caldwell's property. What they found confirmed and surpassed the initial suspicions. Martha, then 20, had 3 living children, Sarah, Joseph, and Rebecca, and was pregnant again. All 3 presented sinai, evident of genetic problems. Sarah, then 4, could barely speak. Joseph, with 3, had a visibly evil head, and Rebecca, with only 1 year, had distorted facial characteristics. "I was disgusted with what I saw, but even more so with Harold's attitude," later reported the Sheriff Pritchard. "He showed no sign of shame or remorse. On the contrary, it seemed to consider it as its natural right." The initial intervention was complicated by geographical isolation and violent resistance of Harold. When the authorities tried to remove Martha and the children, he reacted with a shotgun, resulting in a tense impasse that lasted several hours. It was Martha who, surprisingly, ended up disarming the situation. In a rare moment of clarity, possibly motivated by worrying about her children, she agreed to accompany the authorities so that Rebecca, who had high fever, could receive medical care. This momentary decision opened a window to the outside world that would never close again for Caldwell. Martha and her children were taken to Jefferson City, where they received medical attention and underwent psychological and social assessments. If you are watching this story, leave in the comments "Blood Speaks" so that I know that you are following these historical revelations that have been deliberately hidden from the official history. Initial medical examination has confirmed the worst suspicions, Dr. Reynolds documented. Children have multiple signs of prolonged consanguinity, congenital heart problems, severely compromised cognitive development, facial and cranial malformations, short stature for age, and weakened immune system. Martha herself, the product of previous generations of consanguinity, has similar signs, although less pronounced. The most shocking was the discovery, through blood tests available at the time, that children had extremely high homozymes, a technical term that indicates a severe lack of genetic diversity. Although advanced genetic tests were not available in 1958, the methods of the time were enough to confirm that Harold was both grandfather and children's father. While Martha and her children remained under care at Jefferson City, authorities returned to Caldwell's property for further investigation. What they found revealed the true extent of the situation. Harold's personal diaries, who coldly documented their intentions of purify the Caldwell lineage, birth and previous death records that had never been officially declared, and evidence that other consanguineous relationships occurred within the extended family. Daniel, Harold's eldest son, had a similar relationship with his own daughter, Mary, resulting in 2 children with severe development problems. Ruth, Harold's youngest daughter, had a son whose father was unclear, but he suspected his own brother Daniel. The magnitude of the case attracted the attention of experts in genetics, psychology, and social work from all over the state of Missouri. Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, forensic psychiatrist at the University of Missouri, was called to evaluate Martha psychologically. Martha Caldwell's case represents one of the most extreme examples of psychological manipulation and social isolation I've ever documenting, Dr. Hoffman wrote in his confidential report. It was created in an environment where the normal limits of family relationships were completely distorted, where they had no access to any external reference of normality. The initial interviews with Martha revealed the depth of the psychological conditioning to which she had been subjected. She showed little understanding that her relationship with her grandfather was abnormal or prohibited. For her, that was simply the life she knew, the reality that had been presented to her as natural. Grandpa always said our blood was special, Martha reported during one of the evaluation sessions. That outsiders, they wanted to dilute it, weaken it. It was our responsibility to keep you pure. While the Caldwell case progressed through the Missouri judicial system in 1958, the doctors and geneticists involved meticulously documented the physical and cognitive effects of extreme consanguinity. Presented by Martha's children, Dr. James Harrison, a geneticist at Washington University in St. Louis, was invited to examine children and produce an understanding report on their condition. His work, later published in medical magazines with the names altered to protect identities, has become a fundamental case study on the effects of prolonged consanguinity. What we observed in the Caldwell family is the accumulated result of multiple generations of consanguineous unions, wrote Dr. Harrison. Martha's children are not only the product of the union between grandfather and granddaughter, but they carry on their genetic code, the impact of at least 4 previous generations of marriages between close relatives. Sarah, 4-year-old Martha's eldest daughter, presented what the doctors of the time called accumulated recessive features. Her cognitive capacity was severely compromised, her physical growth late, and she suffered from frequent seizures. At the age of 4, his vocabulary was limited to less than 10 understandable words. Joseph, the 3-year-old son, had microcephaly, a condition where the head and brain are significantly smaller than normal. This resulted in severe delays in the development and neurological problems that doctors anticipated that they would prevent him from developing basic self-care skills. Rebecca, the youngest, with just a year, suffered from congenital heart malformation, similar to the one who had brought her older brother, Adam, to death. Immediate medical intervention was necessary to save your life, something that would have been impossible if it remained isolated in the mountains. Martha's fourth son, still in pregnancy when she was removed from Caldwell, was born in April 1958 at Jefferson City State Hospital. The boy, temporarily appointed as Baby Caldwell in medical records, had multiple complications, including palatal cleft, cast fingers syndactylia, and complex heart malformation. Despite the efforts of the medical team, the baby died 3 days after birth. Autopsy revealed multiple internal defects that would have been incompatible with long-term life, even with medical intervention. Dr. Harrison carefully documented the observable genetic patterns in children. What we are witnessing is the devastating expression of deleterious recessive genes that, in populations with normal genetic diversity, would remain numb. Extreme homozymes in children, Caldwell, means that they inherited identical copies of harmful multiples, both mother and father, grandfather, eliminating the protective effect that genetic diversity usually provides. In simpler terms, each person carries in their genetic code some potentially harmful mutations. Normally, these mutations remain harmless because we received a healthy second copy of the other parent's gene. However, when parents are close relatives, the probability of both carrying the same mutation increases dramatically, resulting in children who receive 2 copies of the harmful gene. Martha herself, the product of earlier generations of consanguinity, although to less extreme degree, also had physical signs of practice: short stature, severe dental problems, and light cognitive difficulties. However, the effects on their children were exponentially more severe due to the direct relationship with their grandfather. The medical team also documented that Caldwell children had a significantly committed immune system. Common childhood infections, such as colds and otitis, were quickly dangerous to them, demanding frequent medical intervention. It's as if their bodies are fighting a constant battle against their own committed genetic code, said Dr. Reynolds in their notes. Your vital energy is so committed to correcting internal defects that you are left with little to combat external threats. In addition to physical problems, psychologists involved in the case documented the emotional and behavioral effects on children. Sarah, the oldest and most verbally capable, demonstrated highly abnormal behavioral patterns. It alternated between periods of deep apathy and explosions of self-digested aggressiveness. Joseph showed stereotyped repetitive movements and seemed unable to form emotional connections with his caregivers. Rebecca, still very young, showed significant delay in normal social development milestones, such as eye contact and response to her name. Dr. Caroline Meyer, a children's psychologist designated to work with the children, noticed in her report, in addition to the cognitive deficits resulting from genetic anomalies, these children suffered severe sensory and social deprivation during their formative years. They were created in an environment where normal development was impossible without appropriate stimuli. No appropriate social interaction. No exposure to the world beyond the isolated property of Caldwell. The Caldwell case quickly became a fundamental study on the effects of prolonged consanguinity, quoted in medical textbooks and used in training programs for social workers, doctors and psychologists for decades after its discovery. Harold Caldwell's trial took place in September 1958, away from the eyes of the public and the press. Missouri's authorities, aware of the extraordinarily disturbing nature of the case, they maintained the procedures in confidentiality to protect the privacy of the victims and avoid turning the situation into a sensational spectacle. Harold, then 61, was considered guilty of multiple accusations, including forbidden relationships, child neglect, and abuse. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, actually a perpetual sentence considering his age. He refused to demonstrate remorse throughout the process, keeping his belief distorted into Caldwell blood purification. "I didn't expect people outside to understand," were their only words during the sentence. "What we did was for the good of the family." Harold passed away at the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1967, at age 70, without ever recognizing the evil he had caused. No family member complained of his body, which was buried in the prison cemetery under a simple tombstone marked only with his prisoner number. The fate of Martha and her children followed a more complex and nuanced path. Martha, evaluated as a victim and not perpetrator, was sent to a specialized psychological and social rehabilitation program in Kansas City, away from the Ork Mountains and the memories they carried. "Martha's case represents a unique challenge of rehab," wrote Dr. Elizabeth Parker, responsible for her treatment. "She needs not only to process the trauma of what she has lived, but essentially relearning what family, relationship, and identity means." The process was slow and painful. Martha, initially confusing and resistant, gradually began to understand the abnormality of her situation prior to the exhibition of healthy social environments and received basic education. The first achievements were particularly difficult. The moment when he realized that what his grandfather had done was universally considered wrong and harmful caused a deep emotional crisis that demanded temporary hospitalization. She described to feel like the floor under her feet was disappeared, Dr. Parker reported. "All your understanding of the world and identity has been fundamentally shaken." Martha's children were initially placed in specialized adoptive homes, capable of dealing with their complex medical and developmental needs. Sarah and Joseph, with the most severe problems, were eventually transferred to long-term care institutions, where they could receive the constant medical attention that their conditions demanded. Rebecca, the youngest and least affected, was adopted by a family of doctors in St. Louis who had experience with children with special needs. Although her cardiac condition requires multiple surgeries during her childhood, she was able to develop a level of functionality that surprised many of the experts involved in her initial case. In 1962, after 4 years of intensive treatment, Martha had progressed enough to be considered able to live semi-independently. Under a new identity to protect her from stigma, she was helped to settle in a small town in northern Missouri, where she worked as an assistant in a local library. He completed his basic education and eventually obtained a high school equivalence diploma. Authorities allowed supervised visits with Rebecca, the only one of their children capable of understanding the concept of mother. These meetings, initially tense and emotionally charged, gradually evolved into a cautious but genuine relationship. Martha never returned to the mountains Ozark. Caldwell's property was confiscated by the state and later sold. The main house was demolished, and new owners, unknown to the history of the site, have established a cattle breeding farm in the area. The other extended family members, called Welluncles, cousins, and half-siblings of Marthe were located by the authorities and received varying degrees of intervention depending on their involvement and condition. Daniel Caldwell, son of Harold and father of 2 children with his own daughter, received a sentence similar to his father's. His daughter Mary and her children received similar treatment to Martha's. The Caldwell case, although kept out of the media spotlight at the time, had a profound impact on Missouri's social work and child protection policies, and eventually across the country, led to the creation of specific protocols to identify and intervene in isolated communities where similar practices could occur. William Reynolds, the rural doctor who first documented the case, dedicated the rest of his career to educate medical professionals about the signs of consanguinity and family abuse. His pioneering work resulted in the publication in 1965 of the Manual for Identification and Intervention in Isolated Communities, which became a key resource for social workers in regions rural ones. In 1970, Martha, then 32, and using her new name, Mary Wilson, had built a modest but stable life. He was still in therapy and had developed some significant social relationships, although he was never married or had more children. According to the monitoring reports of the designated social worker for her case, she had found a delicate balance between recognizing her past and building a future. Rebecca, her new and youngest daughter with whom she kept contact, graduated from high school in 1975, an extraordinary achievement considering her physical limitations and the initial prognosis of doctors. Although he was never able to live completely independent due to continuous heart complications, he worked as a volunteer in a children's hospital, using his own experience to comfort children with complex medical conditions. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to leave your like in this video and share it with someone you believe would also be interested in these historical revelations. If it is not yet inscribed, this is the perfect time to be part of this community that seeks to unravel the darkest secrets in American history. Sarah and Joseph, the most severely affected children, remained institutionalized by the rest of their lives. Sarah passed away in 1978 at the age of 24, respiratory complications. Joseph lived until 1985, dying at 30, a surprising longevity considering the severity of his condition. The latest official register related to the Caldwell case was a letter written by Rebecca to the Missouri Department of Social Services in 1982, requesting access to the original records to better understand their family history. "I don't look for these records for resentment or anger," she wrote. "I look for them to understand who I am and where I came from. I believe that knowing our story, however painful, is the only way to really overcome it." Caldwell's history remains a dark reminder of the consequences of prolonged consanguinity, not only genetic and physical consequences, but also human cost in terms of suffering, lost identity, and lives that never had a chance to achieve their full potential. In a final note of his follow-up assessment in 1980, Dr. Parker wrote about Martha, "The real miracle in Martha's case is not that she has survived the horror of her initial situation, but has found, despite everything, the ability to build something like a normal life. There is a resilience in the human spirit that even transcends the most fundamental violations of our nature." Caldwell ownership in the Ozark Mountains is now unrecognizable, covered by new forests and without visible traces of what happened there. However, the genetic and psychological legacy of what happened in that isolated valley continues to reverberate through generations. A silent reminder that some secrets, once discovered, can never be truly buried.